Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 30 of Truth is Justice. I think there's been some significant contradictions and acts of hypocrisy by some people looking at this case, most notably by Bob and some of his followers. Some of those contradictions have been evidence-based, and we've covered many of those. So what I mean there is where evidence is taken by those people to mean one thing, which contradicts their interpretation of another piece of evidence, or in some cases, even contradicts their interpretation at another point of that exact same piece of evidence. So try and wrap your head around that. Some of the contradictions have been theory or narrative based, and we've covered many of those. That is where a theory or a narrative is offered up by those people and it contradicts itself in so many ways, as in it simply couldn't play out based on their various almost comical explanations of it. And then we have another type of contradiction and elements of hypocrisy, a more philosophical one, I suppose. One where claims are made by Bob and others that various people involved in this matter, formally and informally, have caused unnecessary harm to Sandra because of the comments they have made about the case. And it extends further. They say that unnecessary harm has been caused to Jim's memory because of some of those comments. We've even seen in recent days how some of Bob's followers are furious about what they see as the general poor treatment of, and to be clear, the words they use are the treatment of the entire family, so extending to friends in some suggestions. I thought it would be good to address that a little, because my view is that not only are those statements monumentally hypocritical, but the activities undertaken by Bob and others are beyond comparison. But it seems that Bob chooses to forget about that, or at least put it to the back of his mind. Maybe another case of the now conveniently forgotten claim by Bob that Don murdered Hay. And if you don't know about that one, or you believe that it was some kind of urban myth, here's the audio clip which will refresh your memory.
Absolutely believe that Don killed me.
Now listen to that at the same time as considering these words by Bob, and to quote him, "Well, I have no idea. First of all, I want to make clear, if Don is guilty or not, my position has been, and still is, that Don is a good suspect. I think Don is someone who should be investigated. In no way am I saying that Don did this, but..." End quote. I don't have any particularly strong views on that case. I haven't researched enough to offer anything insightful. But I will say that I am now somewhat suspicious of the way Bob presented it to his audience, especially given my knowledge of the way he has presented the Melgar case. Maybe back then Bob did it all by the book. Maybe he was transparent and open and truly looked at everything equally. Who knows? What I do know is that Bob's supporters have since gone on to claim that that audio clip didn't take place, or if it did, Bob's words were taken out of context. I mean, who would want to own that, right? Who goes and says publicly to a large audience of people, almost screaming for someone's head, that a specific person, someone not charged or convicted of the murder, what person would dare go and say that that person actually murdered someone? Oh, that's right, Bob does. And that isn't following on from that person going through the justice system and being afforded all the protections that the system provides. That isn't following a guilty verdict by a jury of that person's peers. No, it's Bob's statement, supported by his investigation, and heavily based, apparently, on Bob's claim of some form of time card fraud. So on the one hand, we have Bob harshly criticising detectives like Mr. Carazol and crime scene investigators like Mr. Carpenter, and blood pattern analysis experts like Ms. Rossi for essentially putting into practice their years and in some instances decades of experience in their fields for daring to consider the possibility that what they were looking at from 2012 was a woman murdering her husband. But then at the same time, Bob, with a dubious claim to a falsified time card, is comfortable labelling someone a murderer. Some people are of the view that Bob's opinions on that are inconsequential, that he can label someone a murderer if he wants to, and that's fine. It is simply his belief and he is free to share it. I disagree with that view. I think whenever a comment is made in public, potentially to what Bob claims is a worldwide audience of hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom accept Bob's comments as fact, labelling someone a murderer is very significant. But more importantly, Bob himself seems to also not feel that that is appropriate behaviour. Last week's Friday follow-up episode was interesting for the statements Bob made about conduct and behaviour with respect to the privacy of individuals. Now, Bob reflects on the inclusion of Irwin in his list of alternate suspects, Irwin being Jim's brother. He notes how he isn't going to come out and tear this guy's life apart publicly because he may have had some motive. I think that's an honourable claim, but my view is that it is a pretty rich suggestion when it follows on from an episode where Jim's brother Irwin's emotional outpouring at his brother's funeral is described as being interpreted as a confession of sorts, and where a family member, in Liz, provides reason after reason as to why he could have murdered Jim. Now, my point is this. What was the purpose of last week's episode, specifically the discussion about Irwin? What was the point of all of those suggestions about him being aired publicly if, after a little bit of diving into it, and the very next episode, Bob essentially rules him out as a suspect? What was the point, other than to create content for his audience, label a person as a potential murderer of their brother, and add some drama? I'm not of the opinion that that has torn Irwin's life apart in any way, but I am of the view that it isn't a great thing to have something like that thrown out there publicly. And I think this also relates to the claims made that we here at Truth is Justice have somehow contributed to smearing the names of Sandra and Liz, and that we have attacked both of them. And that was truly puzzling for me and for others involved in this project. I don't believe I've attacked Sandra or Liz in any way. See, there's a difference between looking into a case and all of the aspects that relate to it and attacking someone and smearing their name. When we look at holes in Sandra's story, when we look at areas of the case that others like Bob choose to turn a blind eye to, highly relevant areas, we are not attacking Sandra or Liz, or anyone else for that matter. We are genuinely looking at this matter with our eyes wide open and willing to consider everything. Now take yourself back to the beginning of Bob's coverage of this case. Liz herself made the statement several times that she was going into this with the motivation to uncover the truth about who killed her father. That she was prepared to consider every possibility, even if that meant that her mother was the murderer. Now, that position seemed to be very much a case of saying one thing that generates support and compassion, yet engaging in conduct directly in conflict with it. The only reason we're looking at this case so closely is because the case was brought into the public sphere by those people connected with the case. It has been noted that Liz was heavily involved in pitching this case to Bob. With that decision to go public with the case in this type of environment, the podcast, but also to debate intimate aspects of the case on Facebook, comes the acceptance, at least should come the acceptance, that aspects of this case that will be uncomfortable will be raised. Sure, you can hope that people will only look at the areas of the case that are supportive of your position and hope that people will toe the party line and not request their own documents and not have independent thought or objective views and not conduct their own reviews into the theory that perhaps the person that was convicted of the murder actually is the murderer. But that is only hope, and it isn't the reality. The reality is that you have to take it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Yes, Liz's Reddit posts are personal, but they also read like a diary into the problems within the family in the weeks leading up to the murder. I don't think you can get any more relevant than that. Others argue that the family essentially should be off limits in this review. I disagree with that for the reason that that is exactly what this case is all about. You can go on and on and on about a Colombian crime family somehow being involved. Interestingly, that mob connection was also a theory that was floated around for those advocating for O.J. Simpson's innocence. But in the end, it's a domestic homicide, and as a result, the family issues are crucially important. So, going back to the suggestion that we here at Truth is Justice have somehow been disrespectful to the family and friends of Jim through our consideration of many different aspects of the case, the actual way that manifests is confusing. Now, Liz has claimed, as recently as a fortnight ago, that she hasn't listened to a single second of this podcast. I think the way she described it was to say that she would rather gouge her own eyes out with a rusty spoon. Other family members have made similar claims to having never listened to our podcast. I can't be positive, of course, but I can say with reasonable confidence that Sandra herself hasn't listened to a second of our podcast. So how these people are claiming to be so deeply negatively affected by our efforts here at Truth is Justice without listening to the podcast or being involved on our Facebook page is deeply puzzling. Further, those same family and friends see absolutely no issue, at least no one in that group, to my knowledge, has expressed any problem with the suggestions that Jim's brother was his murderer. Literally a direct accusation against Jim's brother by Jim's daughter, and that is, apparently, for those people, perfectly fine and appropriate. I don't understand that. Surely Jim's memory is tainted when you make those kinds of accusations publicly. Surely that is more significant than a suggestion that there were family dynamic and relationship issues in the weeks leading up to Jim's murder and providing evidence for it. In my opinion, it has nothing at all to do with causing harm to the family and friends, and everything to do with exposing the real truth about the case, and through that, harming Sandra's ability to claim that her conviction was a wrongful one. Now, coming back to Bob's honourable claim of not tearing people's lives apart, and his further comment that he hasn't provided the full names of any of the suspects. I think this is a significant point, so I'll quote Bob here. Have you noticed I haven't given you the full names of any of these suspects, unless it is someone who is a convicted, documented person, like Sinead Gonzalez? End quote. Now that was an interesting statement for a number of reasons. It was clearly designed to be a powerful statement about Bob's claimed ethical and moral standing. The first problem being, it isn't true. Not even close to being true. Do you remember his mentioning of Mr. Jared Cox, the one who Sandra's first lawyer described as Liz's ex-husband? He was a potential suspect in Bob's eyes. Well, they talk a lot about him, and then at the end of the episode, Bob essentially says that he doesn't think he was involved. To be clear, Bob doesn't qualify his statement about giving out names, so he doesn't make a statement that it's okay to give a name under certain circumstances. For example, if someone is alive or dead. Bob just says that he doesn't do it. But he does. And that leads us to the second problem. For those of you on the Facebook page associated with Bob's show, those full names are everywhere, absolutely everywhere, of all of the suspects which Bob discusses. So perhaps another qualifier to the name issue is that he doesn't provide all the names on the podcast, but is more than happy for the full details of those people to be passed around freely on the Facebook page associated with his show. And then to the third issue. And this may not come as a surprise, but documents provided by Bob on his website include the full names of many of these people, including Mr. John Malbrough, Ms. Claudia James, and Mr. Jared Cox. Now you might think, oh look, that was simply an oversight by Bob. But no, it seems it wasn't, because on one particular document, Sandra's appeal brief, the name of at least one person, the person Bob names as Chad, is redacted. But Mr. Malbrough, Ms. James, Mr. Cox, no. Don't worry about them, Bob, but equally, hold on to the claims that you don't provide the full names of suspects. So, see, a passionate statement about protecting the privacy of people you claim are suspects in an already solved murder isn't anywhere near as powerful when you actually step back and look at it, when you apply the facts to it. Once again, Bob really doesn't let a small matter of the truth get in the way of a good story. Oh, and as a complete aside, one of the claims made about us at the beginning of the year was that we had been negligent in some way in publishing material which named Liz's current husband. And no real surprise here, but Bob himself has documents up on his website, specifically under the episode 619 documents, that do exactly that. They provide Liz's husband's full name. I suppose one could say, whoops. And another brief point. Statements were also made by Liz that we were somehow negligent in putting up on our website originally the photographs taken of family members on the night Jim was discovered murdered. That is, the photographs of Marissa, Gerson and Monica. Yep, you guessed it. Those same photographs were made available on Bob's website very early on, and they continue to be available. A few other points that I think are relevant to consider, especially at this point in time where Bob is moving on to a new case and presumably applying the same playbook. Now, Bob frames his show as a crowdsourced investigation. The massive problem with that is Bob's mind was made up at the beginning of the season with virtually no access to any case materials. So it was a view not informed by the evidence or an analysis of anything. It was a position that he arrived at based on his communications with Liz. At the same time, Bob makes statements suggesting that he is approaching the cases with no bias, with an open mind and a view to seeing where the material leads him. And in many ways, he has to, because that is the whole point. To get his listeners involved and claim to be guided by them in the direction that the investigation goes, when the reality couldn't be more different. And Bob calls on his followers to contribute their skills in addition to their time and energy, from contributing to the artwork, to editing, to handing out maps, all very helpful, especially in a for-profit business where you can label something as crowdsourced and even have potential radio ads paid for by your very generous listeners. And before people scream that this is bitterness, it isn't. It is calling a spade, and that is what we do here at Truth is Justice. You've heard a lot from me on this matter. I thought it would be valuable for you to hear some thoughts from some other people. Thank you very much to Tricia and Tim for doing this. I think the thoughts you provide are shared by many, many people who have had their eyes well and truly opened during this season.
To Bob's comments from Friday's episode. What if you're wrong, Bob? Do you even care about the people you insulted, harassed, and talked shit about based on nothing more than Liz's word that her mother isn't guilty? You went into this season convinced that Sandy was innocent and had 2 episodes recorded before you had a single case document. You said so yourself. Just because her friends and family said she was nice and quiet doesn't mean she can't also be a killer. I went into the season ready to fight for her innocence. I believed that she was too frail and weak to kill Jim. That was, until I started looking at the evidence. The evidence does not line up with a home invasion theory. At all. And I think you know that. I think that's why you only put out pieces of the evidence. I think that's why you only tell parts of the story that fit your narrative. I think that's why you're so angry and defensive about anyone pointing out anything that contradicts your innocent theory. And to answer your question, I absolutely do not feel bad that I've made Sandy or Liz unhappy. Liz brought this case to you, and together you chose to present it to thousands of people in a less than honest way. You shone a spotlight onto it, and we just dug deeper. Sandy is a convicted murderer who is sitting in prison. Did you really think everyone was just going to take your word for her innocence and not consider her a suspect? How ridiculously arrogant are you? Based solely on the evidence, I have come to the conclusion that Sandy is guilty, and no amount of smoke and mirrors from you or anyone else has shifted that belief. As a matter of fact, the way you've attacked the prosecutor, LE, trial experts, and anyone who disagrees with you makes me even more convinced that you have no evidence that points towards her innocence. When you have to resort to attacking and disparaging people you disagree with, you've already lost the argument. I hope the season was worth it for you. Barnett told you in the beginning that if you found new evidence that pointed to someone else, she'd look at it. And she reiterated that several times. She even opened up her case files to Zellner. The problem is, there is no new evidence, and you know it. So instead of forging a relationship with the prosecutor and working with her in a way that could have opened doors, that could have benefited you on other cases, you chose to attack, insult, and belittle, and in the process, you have shredded all the credibility you may have had. Good luck with your future cases. After this choke of a season, you're gonna need it.
So after listening to Bob's most recent Friday follow-up, part of me just wants to go, what? First of all, would I feel any regret if it came to be that Sandy was innocent? Well, and he made it out like we're actively putting this woman through hell. How? We're calling her a convicted murderer? That's a fact. she's not even listening to the podcast. Hell, he can't even get her on the podcast. And, you know, whether it be because you can barely hear her or whatever the reason is, I mean, he's only had her on there, once, if that. So how's her life being made a living hell? As far as I'm concerned, as it stands right now, she's made her own life a living hell when she took the life of another person. When it comes to making Liz's life a living hell, I don't really think anybody has intentionally made Liz's life a living hell. I also don't feel like Liz is being complicit and just going along with her mother just because. I really feel like Liz truly believes her mother is innocent, and I just don't like the way she presents her information because the inaccuracies look like lies. Maybe she just has so much information in her head, or because I'm sure it's not easy having your mother go away to prison for killing your father and then losing your father and you feeling like you have to pick up the pieces and manage the rental properties, do whatever she has to do to continue on to make sure that this business is normal for what came about in their lives. And not only that, she also has inserted herself in the investigation to try to help out. I'm sure it's not easy for her, and I'm sure that there's a lot of information that gets jumbled. However, us pointing out the inaccuracies is not making her life hell. How is making someone's life hell? I don't know. But as far as Bob saying that he doesn't put people through hell and he has to pay very close attention to how it could affect others, what about the Twitter campaigns against the prosecutor and the medical examiner? You didn't think that made their professional lives hell? What about accusing people or allowing his group to accuse people of murder, anywhere from somebody that was completely unrelated in a completely unrelated home invasion across town to even somebody that doesn't live in the country, such as Sam? It just doesn't make any sense. He can claim, oh, it's not me. He's leading this group. He says he's leading this army for truth and justice. Well, then he's going to have to take some responsibility for what his members do and say as well. That's my whole take on it. So that whole part of the episode was laughable to me because it should show exactly what this season has been all about, which is hypocrisy after hypocrisy after hypocrisy. I don't see how people can't see that. Are they that blinded by him? I don't get it. But that's my take on it.
Thanks for listening to Truth is Justice. We look forward to you joining us next week as we continue to set the record straight.